Here's a question that sounds almost silly until you actually think about it. How did early humans keep having children, generation after generation, without understanding anything about biology? No knowledge of eggs, sperm, ovulation, or genetics. No textbooks, no doctors, no concept of the reproductive system as we understand it today. And yet, here we are, 8 billion people later. So how did populations survive and grow at all when the actual mechanics of reproduction were a complete mystery for most of human history? Let's find out, and along the way, uncover a genuinely surprising twist. For most of that history, population barely grew at all.
Here's the first thing worth clearing up. Reproduction doesn't actually require scientific understanding to function. It's driven by instinct and biological drive, hardwired by evolution long before humans existed at all. Early humans didn't need to understand ovulation cycles or fertilization for those processes to keep happening exactly as they had for millions of years across countless species. In that sense, the mystery wasn't really a barrier. Nature had already solved the mechanical side of things. What early humans lacked wasn't the ability to reproduce. It was an understanding of why or how it worked, which is a very different problem. Compare that to today, where we can explain reproduction down to the molecular level, track ovulation with an app, and even control it with modern medicine. Early humans had none of that conscious understanding, but the biological process itself didn't need their permission to keep functioning. So if biology handled the how, what did early humans actually understand, if anything at all?
Here's where it gets interesting. Early humans weren't clueless about reproduction. They just understood it differently, through observation rather than biology. Many ancient cultures noticed patterns, connections between a woman's monthly cycle and fertility, seasonal patterns in births, and practical knowledge passed down, almost entirely through women, about pregnancy, birth, and childcare. Midwifery, in particular, was often one of the most sophisticated bodies of practical knowledge in early societies. Experienced women assisting births, recognizing complications, and passing techniques down verbally across generations, long before anyone wrote anything down. So while the biological why remained a mystery, the practical what to expect and what to do was actually well understood, refined through direct experience over thousands of years. Which brings us to the real surprise of this story. Despite reproduction happening constantly, population growth itself was almost unbelievably slow for most of human history. So what was actually holding it back? Here's the genuinely surprising part. For roughly 300,000 years of human history, global population grew at an incredibly slow pace. By some estimates, the entire world population grew at an incredibly slow pace for the vast majority of that time. If reproduction was happening constantly, why didn't the population explode much sooner? The answer is brutal but straightforward. Extremely high mortality balanced out high birth rates. Historians and anthropologists estimate that in many early human groups, a significant portion of children didn't survive infancy or early childhood. Disease, injury, food scarcity, and dangerous childbirth all took a heavy, constant toll. Compare that to today, where child mortality in most parts of the world has dropped to a small fraction of what it once was, largely due to modern medicine, sanitation, and nutrition. Early humans weren't failing to reproduce. They were reproducing constantly, just against relentless odds that kept overall population growth painfully slow for tens of thousands of years. So how did any population manage to grow at all under those conditions? Here's a genuinely important survival strategy. Early human children weren't typically raised by just two parents alone. Anthropologists call this pattern cooperative breeding, or alloparenting, where grandparents, siblings, extended family, and even unrelated group members shared childcare responsibilities. This mattered enormously for survival. A single mother facing food scarcity, injury, or illness could still keep her child alive if the wider group stepped in to help feed, protect, and care for that child. Some researchers argue this cooperative structure may be one of the key reasons human children, who are unusually helpless for an unusually long time compared to other animals, survived at all, historically speaking. Compare that to modern nuclear family living, often just one or two parents managing everything alone. Early human communities functioned more like a shared safety net, spreading the enormous burden of keeping a vulnerable child alive across an entire group, rather than just two individuals. This cooperative approach likely improved survival odds significantly, but populations still grew painfully slowly for tens of thousands of years. So what finally changed that?
Here's the honest answer to what actually changed population growth, and it has almost nothing to do with reproductive knowledge at all. It was the arrival of agriculture, roughly 12,000 years ago. Farming created something hunting and gathering rarely could: a reliable, storable food surplus. More stable food supply meant better nourished mothers, shorter gaps between viable pregnancies in some populations, and crucially, meaningfully higher child survival rates. Settled agricultural communities could also support larger groups living closer together, which sounds simple, but represented an enormous shift from small, mobile hunter-gatherer bands. This is the real engine behind accelerating population growth, not a sudden understanding of biology, but a fundamental change in food security and settled living. Compare that to today, where modern agriculture, medicine, and sanitation combined have allowed global population to grow faster in the last 200 years than in the previous 300,000 combined. The knowledge of how reproduction worked came dramatically later. Population had already been quietly growing, slowly and painfully, long before anyone understood the biological mechanism behind it at all.
Here's a detail that puts everything in perspective. A genuinely accurate scientific understanding of human reproduction, eggs, sperm, fertilization, and how they actually combine, wasn't fully established until the 1700s and 1800s, with microscopy advancing enough to actually observe these processes directly. That means humans successfully reproduced, raised children, and grew as a species for hundreds of thousands of years, using instinct, observation, and shared practical experience alone, with the actual biological explanation arriving almost impossibly late in that same story, only a few hundred years ago. Compare that to how routine and well understood reproduction feels today, taught in basic science classes worldwide. For nearly the entirety of human existence, this was simply something that happened, guided by instinct and community wisdom, without anyone truly understanding the biological why underneath it at all.
So, back to our original question. How did ancient humans grow their population with no knowledge of reproduction? The honest answer? They didn't need the knowledge. Biology handled the mechanics on its own. What they actually needed, and slowly built, was practical wisdom, cooperative childcare, and eventually reliable food. Understanding why any of it worked came dramatically later, almost as an afterthought to a process that had already been running successfully for hundreds of thousands of years. It's a strange kind of humility, looking back, an enormous foundational part of human survival, carried entirely on instinct, shared effort, and hard-won practical experience, long before a single person could explain what was actually happening inside the human body. And if this journey into one of humanity's oldest, quietest mysteries got you curious about what we explore next, there's a simple way to come along. Just hit subscribe so you don't miss it.